Just did an event with Dan Harris at the Skirball the other night, which was fun. Thanks to everyone who came out. We spoke entirely about meditation and its benefits and what can be learned about the mind thereby. A refreshing conversation. As is the case with most live events going forward, I'll release the audio to podcast supporters when I get it. And as always, you can support the podcast by subscribing at samharris.org. My event at the Theater at Ace Hotel with Antonio Damasio is coming up next week on the 17th. And I'm looking forward to that. There are still tickets available. And if you haven't been to the Ace, it's an incredibly cool theater. I've never done an event there, but I've gone to events there. Anyway, it should be an interesting conversation. So if you're in LA, I encourage you to come out. There are also some student tickets available. And if you're a student, you can email info@samharris.org from a .edu address to get the code. The event will also be live streamed for supporters of the podcast. So if you're a subscriber to my website, you'll be able to view it there live, and then the video will be archived as well. So just like my first book club event with Steve Pinker. Contrary to what I said last time, the video won't be available immediately after the event. It takes a day or two to get it and archive it. So you can watch it live or you can watch it afterwards, and that may be 1 or 2 days afterwards, but then it'll be on my site permanently for subscribers. A few more events to remind you of. I've got events this summer with Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray in London and Dublin. Those are very big venues. I think those are 8,000-seat auditoriums. So I can only imagine there must still be tickets available there, but those should be interesting. And I have some day-long conferences in Australia and New Zealand in August with Douglas Murray, Majid Nawaz, and Eric Weinstein and Brett Weinstein. And Josh Zepps is moderating. So those should be fun. I also have an event in Toronto with the physicist Brian Greene in September. And there may be a conference along the lines of the ones in New Zealand and Australia coming together in New York. Still working out the details of that. So if you're interested in live events, check my events page at samharris.org/events. And if you want to hear about events and podcasts and articles and books and whatever else is coming from me, I recommend that you join my email list. Email is still the most reliable way to hear from me. And I've been spending much less time on social media, so email is best. Okay, just a little housekeeping for today's episode. A few episodes back, I presented audio from an event I did with Christian Picciolini in Dallas. And that was a fun event. I enjoyed speaking with Christian a lot. Christian, if you recall, was a former neo-Nazi skinhead. In fact, he was the leader of the Hammerskin Nation. And as a young man, he spent many years living like a character out of Clockwork Orange. But then he turned himself around and is now a deprogrammer of white supremacists. But unfortunately in that podcast, Christian said a few things that don't seem to have been strictly true. And as the weeks have passed and that podcast has continued streaming, I've heard from 2 people who consider his remarks to have been unfairly damaging to their reputations. This is a problem that I am quite sensitive to, given what gets done to me by my critics. Somewhat ironically, Christian seems to rely on the Southern Poverty Law Center for much of his information. But this is an organization, as many of you know, which is undergoing a full moral and intellectual self-immolation. In fact, Christian is confused enough about the stature of that organization that he retweeted an article from the SPLC website wherein I am described as a racist recruiter for the alt-right. He has since apologized for that, but the fact that he could have done an event with me and spent 3 hours with me talking about these things and still thought that article was worth retweeting bespeaks a certain level of confusion about what's happening over at the SPLC. Now, this is an organization, I remind you, that my friend Majid Nawaz is now suing for having put him and Ayaan Hirsi Ali on a list of, quote, anti-Muslim extremists. Majid, as you know, is a Muslim reformer and someone who's actually attacked by the far right as a stealth jihadist rather often, while being attacked by dummies on the left as an Uncle Tom, but no one on the left has been so stupid as to allege that he's an anti-Muslim extremist. That is, until the Southern Poverty Law Center got into the game. And like many on the extreme left, when confronted with their errors, they never apologize. They just double down. And while they don't seem to worry about the treatment of women and gays and freethinkers and apostates in the Muslim community, they imagine that anyone who does worry about those things must be motivated by, quote, hate. And if you watch their Twitter feed, you'll see that the SPLC is now worried about things like Cinco de Mayo being an act of, quote, cultural appropriation. So children appear to be running this organization now, and unfortunately these children have at least $500 million to play with. So it's a problem. It's a problem that journalists rely on the SPLC for their information, and it's a problem that people like Christian do too. Anyway, the two people who contacted me in the wake of my podcast with Christian were James Damore, author of the infamous Google memo, and Stefan Molyneux, a Canadian YouTuber with a very large following. At our event, Christian described Damore as a member of the alt-right, to the surprise and consternation of many people in the audience. And he made several specific claims about Molyneux, which concluded that he was a Holocaust denier, or at least something very close to a Holocaust denier. Denying the Holocaust is actually illegal in Canada. He also said that Molyneux had been in conversation with David Duke, the white supremacist nutcase and former Grand Wizard of the KKK. And while I didn't know enough about Damore and Molyneux to challenge Christian's claims on stage, I certainly didn't endorse them, and when we got pushback from the audience, I said that I didn't know enough about these guys to fact-check Christian in real time. However, I've since come to believe that all of these specific charges are false. And given how concerned I am to represent the views of other people fairly, even the views of people with whom I may disagree, in fact, especially people with whom I may disagree, I've decided that we should re-edit those podcasts to remove the misleading statements. So I think Christian is just probably flat wrong about Damore. I still don't know why he thinks he's a member of the alt-right. Perhaps because he appeared on Molyneux's podcast. And as for Molyneux, I don't doubt that there are many things that Christian would like to criticize him for, but that should be for views that Molyneux actually holds and for things that he's actually done. And I spoke with Molyneux on the phone last week, and it was clear from our conversation that these two specific charges were false. He claims to accept mainstream historical accounts of the Holocaust, and making that claim is tantamount to proving that you're not a Holocaust denier. It's very easy to prove you're not a Holocaust denier. You just have to accept the mainstream account of the Holocaust. He also assures me that he's never spoken to or otherwise communicated with David Duke. It seems that Duke just retweeted Molyneux once, and Christian took this to mean that the two were in league with one another. If we're all culpable for the people who retweet us, no one will escape hanging. That simply cannot be the standard by which you identify someone as a racist or anything else. So, given what I've since learned, I wanted to correct the record and apologize both to James Damore and Stefan Molyneux for whatever hassle that episode of the podcast created for them. Needless to say, this shouldn't be taken as an endorsement of anything these men have said or done in the past, or will say or do in the future. In fact, I don't know much more about Damore and Molyneux than I did when I was sitting on stage with Christian in Dallas several months ago. But it's important not to spread misinformation about people, and to apologize when one has. So I wanted to do what I could to correct what has been said about them on this podcast. And the audio from my event with Christian, that's under my control. I can't control what people have done with it by sampling it on their own, but the YouTube and podcast versions that I own have been corrected. Okay, and now for today's episode. Today I'm speaking with Tamler Sommers. You might know Tamler as one of the hosts of the Very Bad Wizards podcast. He's also an associate professor at the University of Houston. He holds a PhD in philosophy from Duke University, and he's the author of a very interesting new book titled Why Honor Matters. And today Tamler and I get deep into the topic of honor and why it might still matter. He certainly thinks it has more value than I do. So we agree on points and disagree on others. But the whole topic is fascinating and consequential. And I hope you feel that we have done the topic some justice. And now, without further delay, I bring you Tamler Sommers. I am here with Tamler Sommers. Tamler, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We've done a bunch of podcasts together. I think mostly you and David Pizarro have been on mine once, and then I've been on yours at least twice, I think.
There were 2 marathon sessions, and then there was you came on when we had just a bunch of guests on to say what you'd changed your mind about.
Right. So for those who aren't aware, although I will have introduced you before this, you are one of the hosts of the Very Bad Wizards podcast, which I love and widely recommend. And you are a philosophy professor and the author of a book that was just published this month, Why Honor Matters.
Yes, Why Honor Matters.
We'll talk about the book mostly. I guess we could also wander off the book, but the book I just got a couple of days ago, so I haven't finished, but I've read enough of to know that it's quite interesting and relevant to many questions of how we live both personally and how we organize society. You're especially concerned about the justice system, so we'll get into all of that. But before we do, I guess, how did you come to this defense of honor? Because there's something rather archaic about waking up one morning deciding that we need more of an honor culture rather than less. How did you stumble on this problem?
Yeah, I mean, this was one of those happy accidents that sometimes you get in academia, where I did, as I think you know, my PhD work, my dissertation on moral responsibility and free will, and I defended a skeptical view, much like yours, and I was particularly concerned with how our retributive intuitions evolved. Our intuitions that people deserve to suffer, that people deserve to be punished, deserve to be blamed. And so I was looking at a lot of kind of cultural and genetic theories in evolutionary biology. And someone recommended to me a book called Culture of Honor by Richard Nisbett and Dov Cohen. Richard Nisbett, a now kind of accidental rival of yours.
Yeah.
But this is just a fantastic book that they wrote. And their idea was that people in the American South, because they are descendants of the Scotch-Irish herders, they tend to subscribe to more of an honor culture than people in the North. And they presented a bunch of experiments that showed this. And so I read the book, and their idea is that these norms and these values tend to emerge in certain kinds of environments, with a particular ecology, with a particular kind of social arrangement. And that just led me to kind of explore those norms and the differences in the values that they had compared to non-honor cultures as it related to responsibility. And one of the things I found was they really don't emphasize control as much as a necessary condition for being responsible or blameworthy. In fact, you could be responsible for something that you didn't even do, but a member of your group did or a member of your family did. And so this became, for me, this huge project of looking at cultural diversity in people's attitudes about responsibility and freedom. And so I wrote a book about that. It's called Relative Justice. It's more of an academic book than this one. But at first, it was just sort of a kind of a curiosity. It was something that I thought was really interesting. And then I found myself getting drawn to some of the values in these cultures and recognizing the absence of some of those values in my own life and in the life of the United States. for better and for worse, but I started to think for the first time, maybe for worse in a lot of ways. And that led me to actually start exploring the idea of a defensive honor, like a honor comeback, reclaiming it in a way that, reclaiming honor in a way that will sort of contain some of its dangers, but harness some of its virtues.
I mean, it's interesting because the dangers are so salient to me that I think we'll disagree on many points throughout this conversation because honor and certainly honor culture seems to capture almost everything we want to outgrow as a civilization, and yet I'm sympathetic to many of your points with respect to what has been lost in our current conception of justice. I mean, I certainly retributive justice has a lot that can be improved about it. The notion of honor does appeal to something very deep in us, and to forsake that appeal across the board comes with a price. I think we have to acknowledge that we pay a psychological price and a social price for just jettisoning these apish values. So it'll be interesting because I think there'll be clear disagreement here, but there is a gray area, and I think perhaps even most of it is gray, and we'll converge on some points. So before we get into the details of honor culture and its application to justice in particular, what is honor and how does it differ from its counterfeits like dignity or self-esteem, which really anchor more of our modern liberal values?
That's unfortunately for me not the easiest question to answer. I think that part of the problem with honor, one of the reasons that people don't talk about it that much, even to criticize it, is that it's very hard to pin down exactly what it is. And this is especially true in philosophy. There's so little philosophical work on honor that it was hard to even find kind of a target or a critic that I could hone in on in trying to write the book. It's a messy concept, and it can mean a lot of things in a lot of contexts. Philosophers especially don't like their concepts messy, but I think this is one of its virtues actually, is because I think its messiness as a concept is well suited to the messiness and complexity of the choices we have to make and the relationships we kind of have, the social relations. But that's dodging the question. Let me just at least try to give some characteristic features of communities that are honor oriented. So one of the things you find across various honor communities is a heightened concern for personal reputation, and a heightened concern for group reputation. So we all value our reputation to some degree, but in honor cultures that is ramped up quite a bit. And along with that comes a heightened sensitivity to insults and a heightened sensitivity to slights or challenges to your reputation. Because if somebody challenges your reputation and you back down, then that's a source of shame in most honor communities. So there is this strong conviction that people should handle their own business in honor cultures, that they should stand up for themselves when they're challenged and not turn to third parties to resolve their own conflicts. And so that's why you have like stop snitching campaigns in the honor culture of the inner city and urban gangs. And, like in baseball and hockey players, I talk a lot about baseball and hockey because those I think are the most honor-oriented sports. When they get into their beefs or feuds, they don't speak to the media, they don't speak to the league. There's a strong code that you have to handle any offenses against or challenges or insults to the team themselves. You keep it all in-house.
I don't know enough about baseball. I was surprised in your account of the beaning of a batter by a pitcher, the intentionally throwing the ball at him is part of the culture of baseball to a degree that I didn't realize. I mean, baseball is a lot more like hockey than I realized.
That's right. It really is, and it's kind of fascinating all the unwritten rules. And this is another feature of a lot of honor cultures is there's just a lot of unwritten norms and codes that go along that just that are part of what governs the way people behave in these cultures, and they're constantly evolving. They're flexible, but they're very internal, and so from an outsider's perspective, they can be difficult to understand. But yeah, I mean, you can hit a home run in baseball and walk a little too slowly, run a little too slowly around the bases, and then that will make you a target for the next time you come up to the plate. There's just so many. It's a pretty Byzantine kind of and dramatic and kind of fascinating set of rules that govern, when you're supposed to get payback, when you're supposed to just just accept that you're being hit by the pitcher because you understand that they have a grievance and they need to get their revenge and then get it over with, and you can move on. And that's very typical of honor cultures. And I think baseball and hockey are examples, in my mind, of successful honor communities because they're able to contain the conflicts and not let them spin out of control. Other features of honor communities, they tend to place higher value on virtues and character traits like courage, hospitality, loyalty, integrity, and maybe this is one of the problems you're going to have with them, solidarity with a particular group. There's a real sense of collective identification and collective responsibility in honor cultures. And there's a sense of tribal, like they're tribal. There's a real tribalism to honor cultures. But I think that word right now, the way it's tossed around today, doesn't capture the sense in which honor cultures are tribal. Today, when we speak about tribalism, we often mean, and I think sometimes when you speak about tribalism and with people like Pinker, and we often mean people identifying with an ideology, like a political ideology or a racial or ethnic ideology. But in an honor culture, there is this sense of collective identification. There is this tribalism, but you're identifying with actual people, not an idea. Actual people, the people in your community who you know and who you interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so that's the sense in which honor communities are tribal.
There are two examples that come to mind that really crystallize what is attractive about honor and what is obviously pathological about it. And I guess I'll just float both of those to you, and because they seem to articulate psychological extremes for me. So, I mean, and there's one you reference in the book. You might reference both, but I saw one. You talk about the satisfaction that awaits anyone who watches YouTube videos where bullies get pounded by the people they were targeting. There's actually a site or a thread on Reddit called Justice Porn, which wraps up some of these videos. So if you watch these, especially if you're a guy, being a guy, I only know what it's like to actually see it with the brain of a man. But I imagine women feel some of the same, if not the same, satisfaction here. So the prototypical case is, there's some thug on the sidewalk who is harassing people as they pass, and eventually he picks the wrong person, who turns out to be a professional boxer or an MMA fighter and just gets destroyed. It's a perfectly encapsulated moral circumstance. It's really like just a mini morality play in like 2 minutes, because this person's culpability is absolutely clear. There's no question that this guy, if anyone deserves to get pounded unconscious, it's this guy. And then it happens, and it seems like a perfect result morally. And again, so it has the feature of there's no appeal to a third party. The person who is threatened is defending himself, in some cases herself. Okay, there's some great videos where women, wind up destroying the guy who's harassing them. Those are especially satisfying. And it's hard to see what's wrong with it except when you scale it to the rest of society. If you're going to run a society this way, you have to acknowledge that the full chaos and dysfunction of vendetta and vigilantism is the result. And civilization, as you mentioned Pinker, as he's pointed out again and again, in large part depends on our outsourcing the use of force to the state. And yet these videos would be very different if they just entailed somebody, getting on the phone and calling the police and watching the police show up and arrest the guy, which is how it has to work in an orderly society. As a counterpoint to this, I would say that almost the reductio ad absurdum of honor as a force for good is the concept of honor killing, which you see it's very widespread in the Muslim world. It's not only there, but in traditional societies, it's often imagined that the honor of the family is fatally threatened by any sexual indiscretion on the part of any of the women in the family. So if a man's daughter refuses to marry the person he's chosen for her, or has sex out of wedlock, or just is caught holding some guy's hand to whom she's not married, in these societies and in these communities, even within our own societies, you often hear about a father and a brother killing a young woman for the imagined offense to the family's honor that has been given here. And so, if you could see a YouTube video of that, there'd be none of the satisfaction for anyone standing outside of that circumstance. I'll just give you both of those examples to react to.
Yeah. Okay. So let me take the justice porn one first, and then I'll address the honor killings. I mean, certainly nothing in this book is anything but horrified by honor killings, and I take it really seriously as a problem. But let me first go back to what makes those videos so satisfying. I think the way you framed it is that it's perfect justice because this bully gets exactly what he deserved. I mean, assuming that it is a guy, which it almost always is. And I think that it's even a little bit more than that, or it's significantly more than that, because you could imagine just a stranger punching the bully, just kind of a bystander, an impartial bystander punching the bully, and then that's not as satisfying. What's especially satisfying about those videos is that a person who was going to be a victim, who's going to be bullied, stands up for themselves. And the sense of respect that comes with that, self-respect, respect from the community, respect from the people who are watching, I mean, it's palpable and you can see it, and it's tangible. And sometimes it even comes from the bully. Sometimes even the bully respects the person that just knocked them out because they stood up for themselves. That's a very common dynamic, and that is exactly what is lost when you marshal out these kinds of conflicts to some impartial third party. That's why, I say in the book, it's not justice porn. It's not even remotely justice arousing to, have the bully be taken away by a security officer or the principal and get suspended or even expelled. At that point, it's like, well, maybe the school needed to do that because of the harm that he was causing, but that's sort of the lesser of evils rather than an assertion of self-respect. Now, sometimes that's not possible, and that's the problem. That's the problem with honor cultures, is sometimes the power imbalance is too great and you can't stand up for yourself, and you need third parties to come in and prevent great injustice. And that's where this idea of containment comes in. But we shouldn't lose, and this is one of the things I feel like we've lost lose or reject the value of standing up for yourself, of being willing to take a risk that maybe you will get your ass kicked or something, but at least you are showing that you can't be pushed around, and you're not immediately turning to a third party to handle a conflict that directly involves you. Okay, so that's the justice porn one. That's the easier example for me. Honor killings, I think, are an extreme example of one of the problems with honor, which is that there is very little restriction on the content of honor norms. So all honor groups have norms and codes that determine how honor and dishonor are allocated within the community. And there are some commonalities, but there are also a lot of differences. And there's nothing within the sort of honor morality that constrains what those codes are. So if you have a community, like certain cultures, where just the suspicion or the reality of extramarital sex on the part of a family member will reduce the honor of the family, that will make the family dishonorable. And you called that imaginary, and it's imaginary. It's not imaginary for them. They are dishonored, and they are treated poorly by the people in that community. Now that's a fucked up. Are you allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes, indeed, you are.
That's a fucked up norm, right? That's a fucked up way of allocating honor and dishonor, and especially dishonor or shame in this case. But that's what happens in these communities, is that the family honor and all the privileges that come with being an honored member of the community, and all the shit that comes with being a shamed member of the community, that will happen to the family unless they act in the way that they feel they need to act. And often they don't want to do it. Often it's like a duty. It's like some sort of weird, perverse duty, moral duty, that they feel like they have to kill the sister that they love, or the daughter that they love, in order to preserve the family's family's honor for generations. And so this is a huge problem with honor, that we don't have those kinds of restrictions about what the norms will be that determine how honor and dishonor are allocated. And that's another goal of containment, is to make sure. So, in my world, if you find an honor community where this is their way, this is their value, this is their way of allocating honor and dishonor, then you don't allow that. So you do need some kind of higher authority that will enforce a minimal respect for human rights in a way that would rule out honor killings. But again, that doesn't mean you throw out the baby with the bathwater. That doesn't mean that the fact that there are honor killings in the vast minority of honor cultures across the world and throughout history. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny percentage of cultures that find this to be morally acceptable or not dishonorable to kill a family member. The fact that that exists doesn't mean we should throw out honor and all the motivational benefits that come with it.
I guess the thing I would argue here is that the only thing that would value honor appropriately, morally and psychologically, and the only thing that would contain its perversions would be some kind of consequentialist understanding of its effects on individuals and on society. So, I mean, the reason why it's bad to have notions of male honor that extend to the sexual behavior or even the sexual misfortune of women in the family. So, I mean, as you know, honor killings even happen when a girl gets raped because she's viewed as sullied by having been raped. I mean, that's like the perfect case of moral lunacy where a father kills his daughter because of the shame that has been brought to the family over her rape. So you would want to argue that that kind of honor is pathological on the grounds that it creates immense human misery for no good reason and doesn't create any benefit that outweighs that misery. Whereas in other cases where you're talking about things like hospitality and the kinds of moral heroism that can be motivated by things like honor and can't quite be motivated by its cousins like self-esteem
Or dignity. Yeah.
or dignity. Yeah. And then you want to argue for its place because it does good for us. But again, like even going to the best possible case, or at least the best case we've mentioned so far, which is these justice porn videos, there you can argue that there's a higher norm to which even people who are chock full of honor would adhere in those circumstances. So, for instance, I've spent a lot of time thinking about self-defense and violence, and I've spent a lot of time training in martial arts, and I'm surrounded by people who have a tremendous amount of martial honor. But because they have so much honor and so much experience, I mean, these are, world champions in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and, SWAT team members and Navy SEALs. I mean, people who are just, who have absolutely no doubt about their ability to handle situations of, interpersonal violence. These are people who, when they, walk around in the world and see behavior of the sort that, we're seeing in those videos, they're not the guys who run up and punch the bully in the face. Because one, they have absolutely nothing to prove from that contest. I mean, they know they can punch the bully in the face. If they decline to punch the bully in the face, they will not lose sleep that night wondering what it says about them, right? They're not going to be racked by doubt about their own martial abilities. They see these things in very pragmatic terms, and they just realize they have a lot to lose if things go haywire. They've been in enough fights themselves that they know what follows. They know, you punch a bully in the face and your hand gets cut and you've got his blood in your wounds, and now you have to worry about whether or not, you need an AIDS test. There's the possibility of getting arrested and having witnesses misunderstand what happened there. And now you have, criminal or civil charges against you. There's a huge hassle awaits you if you get involved in any of this stuff. And so when you talk to people who understand human violence really deeply, these are not the people who you see meting out vigilante justice in those kinds of videos, and nor would they if when you talk about what they would do in those situations. This becomes especially true when you imagine what it's like to walk around armed. I mean, people who I know who carry concealed weapons, you don't get into shoving and punching encounters with strangers when you have a gun on your belt, because you're then 2 steps away from having to decide whether you're in over your head and now it's escalated to a lethal encounter with all of the legal ramifications. So people who are walking around armed are often just the first to just dial 911 and not go near situations like that.
Right. And that, I mean, at a certain point, the consequences do become too dire to do the thing that I think honor cultures and honor codes tend to promote, which is to handle your business and not involve some sort of stranger or a third party. I mean, I want, but to respond to your claims about the Navy SEAL people, the jiu-jitsu experts that that's a very common feature of honor cultures, that if it's clear that they can, if they needed to, if called upon, respond to some sort of insult or challenge to themselves, then they often don't need to. I mean, the whole reason some of these honor norms on this aspect of honor norms evolved is to give people an incentive to preserve a reputation that means you can't be messed with, right? And they have that reputation already. They have nothing else to prove, as you say.
But Tamla, except they might only have it in their head in that context. I mean, so if you imagine you're traveling with your wife and you're in a bar that you've never been in before and will never be in again, and you don't look like some colossus who would scare people at a glance, but you're a Navy SEAL or whatever who has no doubts about his ability to protect himself and his wife, and you might even be armed, say, right? And so somebody at the bar challenges you and even insults your wife, like the prototypical case where you would have, as a man, you would feel tempted by, a million years of hominid evolution at your back to defend yourself and your partner. That is precisely the situation where it's most tempting, where people who have this kind of discipline see the downside and just walk away and actually don't save face in that context. The bully has the satisfaction.
But there's no community to save face to there. These are strangers, as you say. So there's no real incentive to save face because nobody knows who they are in the first place. There's no reputation to either lose, preserve, or augment, right? And I don't know, like, I want to interview one of these people right now and ask what would happen if they're at a bar with their wives or their daughters and somebody does insult them or seems physically threatening or starts to hit on one of their wives. I don't know if they're really going to walk away from something like that if they feel like the consequences of engaging that it's not going to lead to a gunfight, which most bar fights don't lead to gunfights, and most conflicts don't lead to anything worse than just somebody getting their ass kicked.
Obviously, there's what they think would happen or should happen, and then there's what would actually happen when push comes to shove, literally. But, I've had many of these conversations, and I know what people aspire to do in those situations based on what they consider to be a higher ethic that even does preserve this notion of honor. I mean, if you've come out of an honor culture like, the Navy SEALs, right? I mean, so the Navy SEALs are badasses. They have, their training has many of the features you describe of an honor culture.
Yeah, I talk about them a lot in the book, actually.
But the net result, when you export that to living in a more cosmopolitan society, it becomes reduced down to a kind of higher ethic, which is, it would be a kind of failure if it's a failure to have avoided conflict that was in fact avoidable. And avoidance is still a kind of master principle there, given all of the uncertainty that comes with conflict. And yet there is a kind of, I mean, if you're honorable enough, if you're secure enough, I mean, I guess this is where self-esteem maybe swallows honor. If there really is no threat to your view of yourself when backing down from a challenge, then you're free to do it in a way that somebody who is more threatened isn't. The person who's easily goaded into a fight that he can't win just because he finds it so intolerable to lose face, that's a person who's just a monkey being manipulated by eye contact and insults.
Yeah, I mean, so I think we agree about this in this sense where there's nothing about honor that suggests that in every context you need to act in a certain way. I mean, this is one of the best things about honor codes and honor values is how flexible they are. And so in contexts where standing up for yourself or standing up for your family or standing up for your friends isn't appropriate according to their codes, then they're not going to do it. And you're right also that you need a certain level of self-regard and confidence in your abilities that you won't be lying awake in bed for the next 2 weeks kind of thinking about how you should have stood up to the person or how you should have said something or how you shouldn't have just walked away and listened to them taunt you or whatever it is. If you have that level, this isn't just true when it comes to violence. This is true in most aspects of life. When people insult you in a way that you don't feel like they have the standing to really affect your reputation and the way you view yourself, then it's easy for that to just glide off of you. But when you're in a situation where you do feel like your self-respect is at stake and you do feel like your reputation amongst people you care about is at stake, well, then that's a different story. But in the kinds of situations you're describing, it doesn't seem like either their self-respect or their reputation is at stake here. So yeah, you absolutely in those kinds of situations can do the thing that will not lead to some kind of unpredictable calamity or something like that. And in some ways it's a point of pride. It's like a kind of a warrior value to be able to have the kind of self-control that you don't get triggered like that in situations when it's not warranted. I mean, that is a big part of warrior culture, a big part of a code. I mean, you see this with samurais, is restraint, not giving in to violence when it's not called for, is as much of a virtue as being violent when it is called for.
The real concern with honor as a major plank in one's morality is that it creates a kind of attractor state where incentives get all screwed up, and the problem is that it is dependent on how others view you, or at least how you imagine they will view you, and then that begins a kind of spiral of needless norm enforcement, which becomes highly non-normative if you stand back outside of that culture and look at the consequences. And so there are many examples you give in the book. One example, which I often think of here, is prison culture, where incentives are so badly aligned that even good people will reliably turn into monsters simply because there is no alternative, given what everyone else will do to them if they don't prove that they can be monsters.
Right. You have to project a kind of almost insane toughness so that you're not taken advantage of and and punked, and that's true for people who just aren't like that, who aren't disposed to that, but that they have to make that part of their identity. This is true. Elijah Anderson, a book I quote a lot in the book, the sociologist Elijah Anderson, and his book Code of the Street. But this is also true, I think, of young kids in certain urban neighborhoods. And these are kids that they want friends and they want to have a normal high school experience. They want girls, but they also want to not be sitting ducks for the more aggressive kids in the neighborhood. So they have to establish some kind of reputation for toughness so that they're not taken advantage of and thought to be weak. And again, even if that's not who they are, even if they don't have a kind of disposition for violence or aggression, they have to project that. And they have to do it. This is just their environment. This is just the environment in prison. You have to project that kind of image. And when it's successful, they can do it and not have it swallow up their identity entirely. Because there is this kind of tricky point, equilibrium point, where you've shown that you're tough enough that you can handle any challenges and insults that come at you, but nobody feels like you need to go any further than that. And then they'll just leave you alone. So if you can project this image of being violent, if called upon to be violent, then you don't actually have to engage in acts of violence and you won't be the victim of violence. But if you're not able to do that, then you're more likely to be a victim.
Right. But so all of that seems to be an advertisement for some prior stage of humanity that we are wise to have outgrown, at least outside of a prison or outside of a gang or outside of a ghetto that's crime-ridden, or these are all places we are busily leaving, both as individuals and who are lucky and as societies which are structured along different lines. And yet you seem to worry we're leaving something critical behind in that flight.
We're leaving the values that come from how to survive in those kinds of environments, because we have not, as a society, figured out a way to extinguish all these kinds of scenarios and social environments where people will be threatened in this way, and where your reputation can ensure that you'll either be left alone or that you'll be a kind of a victim. And, while the fact that there are prisons and the conditions in prisons which are abhorrent, and the fact that there are these really poor neighborhoods where people are desperate, that's a bad thing. But that doesn't mean that every value that comes from those kinds of environments and how to handle yourself in those kinds of environments, that can actually be a real positive that we shouldn't lose just because we're so worried about the kinds of conditions that these environments have, poverty or prison. A good example is, I think, the military and the soldiers there. They develop a kind of code and a strict honor code. In the Navy SEALs you were talking about, right? They have a code that is crucial to them, important to them. Involves collective accountability, collective responsibility, never leaving a brother lying out in the field, right? And then they leave those kinds of environments, but they retain the values that they acquired in those environments, and the kind of environments they go into, and the kind of environments that necessitate embracing those kinds of values. They're often really dangerous and something normally we would want to avoid. But the values that they bring out of that is something that stays with them for the rest of their lives. And I'd be surprised if you found any Navy SEALs or really military anywhere saying that they want to turn away from honor and the kind of honor values that were instilled in them when they were at war or in boot camp or wherever it is that they really started to internalize it.
There are just these other parts of the honor picture that seem dispensable in the end, and maybe we can purify this notion of honor to something that is compatible with a more modern, liberal, consequentialist value system. But you mentioned tribalism briefly, and also the notion that of kind of collective responsibility for things, so that even if you do something terrible to another person, he or even a member of his family could retaliate against you, obviously, but not even necessarily just against you, but anyone close to you. So if you kill someone, well then their family can kill your brother, say, as in retribution, and that somehow honor makes sense of that instrumental violence, where you're targeting someone who's actually not responsible for anything here, but because of their association with the responsible party, it's deemed legitimate to target them because of the effect that will have on the person who you actually do have a grievance with.
See, I disagree with that interpretation of collective punishment and collective responsibility. I don't think it's instrumental. It often achieves instrumental goals, like, showing that the family is not to be messed with. But I think in honor cultures, in true honor cultures, they think it's just. They think if someone from your group, in an easier to relate to example, when you get into a beanball feud in baseball and the opposing pitcher hits one of your batters, if you're in the American League, that pitcher isn't going to come up to the plate. So you're going to just hit another guy on that team. And, yes, there's instrumental value in doing that to show the other team that you can't throw at your players, but there there's also a sense that this is the right thing to do. This is the just thing to do. That if that team has a pitcher that will do that, then everyone on that team is accountable for that. And I think, that maybe seems irrational, certainly from a perspective that we come from where individual responsibility is the only thing that can possibly matter. And as you believe, and I used to believe, you can't even really make sense of individual responsibility, moral responsibility in the kind of desert entailing sense. That just seems totally insane. But I think there's a lot of moral advantages to that kind of attitude. And I think you can see them when you think, look, it's not just about punishment. It's not just about getting revenge on some family whose brother may have injured or killed your family member. It's also about like making up or compensating somebody for something that your family member did, right? It's that same instinct, that same norm that encourages, that motivates people to say, look, I know it was my brother who harmed you, but my brother can't make it up to you. My brother can't make this right, but I can. And I feel obligated to do it.
Yeah, that resonates with me.
And the only reason they feel obligated is because they feel that sense of collective identification, that sense of collective responsibility. Well, even though I didn't do it, I had no control over whether my brother did it or not. I still feel an obligation to try to make it right, to try to make up for what my brother did. And you see that in honor cultures quite a bit as well. So it's not all of the dark side of these blood feuds and Hatfield and McCoys and these long multi-generational cycles of violence. It's also a sense of justice that, yeah, it's not just you. You're responsible for the people around you. And that also, as a side benefit, encourages a healthy amount of self-policing within groups. Because now you know that if one of your group members fucks up, you're going to have to pay for it in some way.
I'm certainly open to the utility of all of these ideas and social structures. Again, the cash value for me morally is always the consequences of thinking in these ways and obeying these various norms. And yeah, so I mean, you allude to my view of free will as undercutting any notion of real responsibility in the ultimate sense, or as it's imagined to exist by people who believe in free will. But
you would think that's like ultimately just as irrational to think that somebody is individually responsible as for an act that they did, as it's no more rational to think that than it is to think that you're responsible for what a group member did, right? I mean, according to your view?
except for the consequences of holding people responsible in those cases. I mean, the reason why it makes sense to hold you responsible for much of what you do is that doing that reliably modifies what you will do in the future. Whereas if I held you responsible for what other people did, it can't actually modify what other people will do in the future unless you are a lever that influences them reliably. Your brain will influence another person's behavior less reliably than his brain will. And that's why the locus of control is the other person.
Well, that depends on the situation. If you have a tight community where there's a lot of self-policing and a lot of people keeping a lid on their fellow group members' behavior, then there can be plenty of utility in punishing.
Then the question is, what is wrong with instrumental violence? Like, what is wrong with kidnapping the children of a bad person and, threatening to torture them to influence that bad person? Well, you don't have to be a Kantian to see that there's something unsavory about living in a world where at any moment innocent children can be captured and tortured so as to influence their parents, because we've just discovered this is a great way to influence parents. Other things begin to shift once you start treating people as props in this way. I mean, the reason why a focus on the individual seems to be such a good moral heuristic so much of the time is that it is what it is to treat people as ends in themselves, right? And that seems to maximize things like the golden rule and the actual concern for both the effects of your actions on others and how those others will be changed and how they will behave in the future.
But these are empirical claims that you're making, right? So you could certainly imagine worlds where it just wouldn't be true that holding the locus of responsibility at the individual level doesn't produce the best consequences. And there are probably environments where, like actual environments, not just imagined environments, but actual environments where that's not the case. I mean, that's the whole Nisbet and Cohen idea of why honor norms arose in the first place, is the environment was conducive to them. There was very limited third-party enforcement. There was very high cost of getting your family or group being a victim of a raid that could completely destroy the wealth of your entire family, because they're herders and the animals are all they have. So if someone steals the animals, they don't have anything anymore. And so you have to project a kind of image that deters people from making the attempt to steal the wealth of your family. And projecting that image requires that you don't just hold individuals responsible, you hold potential raiding groups responsible for what an individual within that group will do. So, I mean, you might be right that individual responsibility leads to the best consequences in all environments, or...
No, it is an empirical question, but these environments that seem to function by other norms or honor-based norms are these kinds of environments that are more akin to a state of nature or a moral emergency or some psychological experiment that we are quite happy not to be living in. So whether it's a prison or a gang or a war or a condition of such scarcity where if there's a challenge to your status, everything you've worked so hard to attain is ruined. There's no social safety net. There's no Leviathan to come in and help and restore order. It's all on you at all times. Otherwise, your children will be devoured. The further we get from those conditions, it seems more and more we discover the wisdom of outsourcing uses of force and coercion to a third party.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is probably where we might have a point of disagreement as well, because I think Leviathans have serious costs. And I think you see that in the United States. We have such an aversion to violence that the response to an uptick in violence in the 70s and 80s led to a prison population of 2.3 million people and led to some of the conditions that we talked about earlier. And that has sort of trickled down to school discipline policies, zero tolerance policies in school for violence, which I try to show has created a kind of school to prison pipeline, and many other people have shown it better than I have. And I think we're wrong to assume or to congratulate ourselves that we live in this perfectly enlightened culture when the costs of having such a strong central enforcement system are so high, and they're often invisible to us. I mean, we don't see the people who are in prison. We don't see what they have to go through. We don't see the suffering that's caused. And that is a direct result of us deciding to marshal out every conflict that we get into. to a specialist and being unwilling to take the risk of being a victim to violence, so that we have to get everyone who has a propensity for that off the streets for a long time. So I think that we have to reckon with the costs of what this kind of ability that we have to just not handle when we're challenged ourselves, that's come at a tremendous cost. And it's a cost that we don't often experience, but that people behind bars experience way too much. And often the racial disparities there are completely unjust. I'm sure you agree with this, and unjustifiable.
Well, so that's interesting. So I think your description of the incarceration problem, at least here, I don't know about in your book, leaves out the important variable of just how insane the war on drugs has been. If you didn't lock people up for truly victimless crimes in this society, then the people who would be in prison would be the people who had proven that they were willing to use violence to, at minimum, rob others.
But what percent of people in prison, of those 2.3 million people, do you think are there for nonviolent drug crimes?
I would think it's probably at least a third, but I would bet it would be closer to half.
It's like 5 to 6%.
No.
So drug sentences in general are responsible for 16% of prisoners in state prisons, which is the vast majority of the prisoner population. And only 5 to 6% of that group are low-level and nonviolent criminals. So it's not just drug crimes that have
changed? Has that changed recently, or have we just quietly let out a lot of nonviolent drug offenders and I didn't notice, or were there never that many in prison in the first place?
Yeah, I think just how insane it is that we lock people up for possession of marijuana or various other drugs has led us to think that that's a bigger part of the problem than it actually is. I mean, I think it's kind of a self-serving myth to tell ourselves that if we just didn't lock up people for nonviolent drug crimes, then our mass incarceration problem would go away. In fact, there were a couple of books recently, I don't have them handy right now, that shows that if we really want to make a dent in the prison population, we need to not just stop putting people in prison for nonviolent drug crimes, but reduce the amount of time that people spend in prison for violent crimes.
I just Googled this, so here clearly is the basis of my confusion here, which is that in federal prisons, half of people are locked up for drug offenses. But as you say, there's only 200,000 people in federal prisons and nearly 1.5 million in state prisons. And there, as you say, 16% have drug crime as their most serious offense. I've clearly been advertised to with the federal prison data and not the state prison data. So then you sound like you're doubting the wisdom of locking up people who have proven their willingness to use violence against innocent people in our society to steal their stuff or rape them or, in the extreme case, kill them. Why would you be skeptical about that?
I'm not skeptical of locking up rapists or murderers or people who are offenders, of serious assaults. I do think we have to think long and hard about how much time we put people in prison for some of the less serious violent offenses. And, one of the big things I promote, really the thing that is most exciting to me in the book and that I'm most excited about pursuing in future research, is restorative justice as a way of addressing both nonviolent crimes, but also violent crimes, and allowing victims and offenders to get together and determine within boundaries how they can resolve the conflict that that they had. And I think this, with violent offenders, when this has been implemented, when restorative justice models have been implemented, it can be extremely effective, both in involving the victim and making the victim feel less alienated by the justice system, and also really effective for the offender in understanding the consequences of the personal consequences of what it is they've done. And so it is an effective way of promoting or just getting the offender not to offend again. You see really low recidivism rates among people who have gone through the restorative justice process. But that does mean that they will get less prison time in many cases than they would have otherwise. And so, yeah, it's not that you never put these people in prison. It's that you think long and hard about the length of their sentences and whether the kind of justice system that we have is the best way of handling those kinds of offenses.
I would be the first to admit that given that most people who go to prison will be coming out of prison and back into society, we want prisons to be very different places than they are, and we want to think about what the goal of incarceration should be. Given that prison tends to function as a kind of graduate school for criminality, the system is totally broken because these people come back into society having been given no tools by which to change their lives, and they've been given additional tools by which to harm others. So let's just talk about the justice system and how it's broken, and how would you differentiate retributional justice from restorative justice?
Yeah, so this is where we might find some common ground, I think, because I think both of us are no fans of retributive justice and that ideal as it's both practiced and promoted within the United States. I mean, your problems with it are it assumes a level of autonomy that in the criminals that is not something that they actually have. A level of free will, a level of moral responsibility that, when you examine it, doesn't hold up. For me, I just think this whole idea that we have, where you take an offense and you look at the severity of the offense and you look at the blameworthiness of the criminal and you match that to a specific punishment, and then everyone who has committed a crime with that degree of culpability is supposed to, this never happens in practice, but supposed to get that same punishment. That way of understanding criminal justice, which is the way that we embrace in this country, both at a theoretical level and at least is aimed for on a practical level, though not achieved. But I just think it's based on a kind of an illusory understanding of autonomy. So I agree with you there, and it just doesn't hold up rationally. I mean, there's no basis for it, and the effect of it is to exclude the victim entirely. The victim becomes this kind of vessel just to determine the severity of the wrong. But after that, their needs, their desires, what they want, that's completely excluded from the criminal justice process. And so restorative justice is this recent movement that has gained some momentum, especially in Australia and New Zealand, maybe some parts of Scandinavia, and in the United States has gained a lot of momentum in the schools, to great effect, but not as much in adult criminal courts. It's making some traction in juvenile courts, but it's a movement that I can't endorse enough, that that takes direct aim at how depersonalized our current criminal justice system is. and our current disciplinary approaches in a wide range of domains of life are. So the essential principles of restorative justice are these. First, they view crimes or offenses as conflicts between individuals and only secondarily as violations against the state. So if you commit a crime in the United States, you go on trial, it'll be not you versus the person you harmed, you versus your victim, but it'll be you versus the state or the people versus Tamler Sommers. And restorative justice brings it back, no, it's not the state that got assaulted. It's me that got assaulted. It's the victim that got assaulted. And that's how restorative justice views the conflict as it actually happened, not as if it was some sort of imagined transgression against a undefinable population of people. So that's the first sort of essential principle. The second is that the primary aim of criminal justice is to repair the harm that was done, to resolve the conflict, and also to restore harmony within a particular community. And that the goal of the legal system should be to enable the relevant parties, the stakeholders, they sometimes call them, the relevant parties, the victim, the offender, the families, and other community members who are affected, that they can all actively participate in an attempt to find a resolution to that conflict, and to resolve it in a way that is meaningful and right for them. This is something that Charles Barton, who's a big advocate of restorative justice, says. And it's funny, it gets attacked from all sides because it's so localized and because it has sort of right now not too much theoretical grounding, but when it's implemented, the effects of it are so tangible and so positive that you just have to either read a detailed account, sit and watch an example of a restorative justice mediation circle, and you just see the benefits of it, and not just consequentialist, although I think there are definitely consequentialist benefits from it, but it just feels more just in the same way like the justice porn. The victim standing up to the bully seemed like that was the perfectly just outcome. When restorative justice works, it's the same thing. And so it's something that I promote in the book in chapter 6. I try to expose or illuminate the fraudulence of the theoretical underpinnings of our current criminal justice system, and show how restorative justice can help us remedy those problems. But this is also something I want to pursue in my next project in more detail.
So I would say that if there are benefits to it, that they have to be consequences. I mean, you just have to extend your notion of what a consequence is to include it seeming more just and all of the satisfaction we get from that experience.
Well, that's fine. I'm happy to frame it in those terms.
So let me give you some examples here and just track me through how restorative justice would respond to them. So, somebody breaks my hand, either through negligence or through, criminal intent. It's obviously a bad thing for me to have my hand broken, but it doesn't completely derail my life. But if I were a surgeon, whose livelihood depended on the use of both hands, that would be a very different sort of crime or debt between me and the perpetrator that would have been formed there. And you can think of other cases where I'm one of the greatest pianists on earth, and now that I have a broken hand, I'm no longer one of the greatest pianists on earth and never will be again, let's say. So you can imagine in that case, the handbreakers of the world would experience a very different outcome in court depending on whose hand they broke and the size of the debt incurred. Is that what?
I mean, it would depend on what the pianist or the doctor wanted. You know, you're right that the harm there turns out to be greater than the offender could have possibly foreseen. I take it that's the point of this story, that the offender had no idea that he was actually assaulting a pianist or a doctor that depended on the use of their hands.
He's just into breaking ordinary hands and didn't realize he was
Right.
breaking extraordinary hands.
But, that doesn't mean that the doctor or the pianist will be more vindictive in how they want the matter resolved. It's possible that they are, but that they will be. But, these are the kinds of things that just get worked out in the mediation process. And I should say that these kinds of mediation processes, they take their inspiration from the way that honor communities and honor cultures, tribal cultures handle conflicts as ways of trying to, you take that person in the current criminal justice system, and the pianist still has broken hands, and now the offender can't really do anything for them, right? They can't talk to them. They can't explain why they did what they did, and they're just going to end up going to prison. The pianist is no better off, right? But at least if you have this kind of circle where the offender now is trying to make right what the offender did, and it will be hard in that kind of case, but at least there's an opportunity to do that in a way that our current criminal justice system denies, again, both in practical terms and in even in theory, right? Even in principle, it just shouldn't matter what the victim, all that matters is what could the offender have possibly foreseen when committing this crime.
Well, then it seems like in this paradigm, you should be able to, if you can compensate the victim, I mean, given that the locus of concern here is the victim and not society, then, rich offenders should be able to just compensate victims and make them whole and then have no further punishment, right? So if Bill Gates runs around breaking people's hands, he should just find out at the end of the day what their hands were worth to them. And presumably everyone has a price, even surgeons, right? Here's 10 years worth of lost wages or 100 years worth of lost wages or double that. And, now you can just forget about being a surgeon.
So two things on that. I mean, first of all, I think that not everybody is just going to be satisfied with getting money for, people aren't concert pianists just for the money, right? So they're not going to be satisfied with however much money Bill Gates would give them. But secondly, the kind of restorative justice model that I favor does have both a floor and a ceiling for the kind of punishment or the kind of outcome that can be reached through the restorative process. So if there's a certain crime, say physical assault, breaking bones, a stab wound, or whatever, there might be a kind of a minimum prison sentence that will have to be served, and certainly in every restorative model, a maximum sentence. So even if you have a really vindictive victim who wants the highest possible punishment, they can't go beyond whatever the ceiling, where the ceiling is set. But so you can't, if you're a rich offender, buy your way out of any kind of crime. There will always at least be the floor level punishment, at least according to the model that I subscribe to. Now, that said, if the rich offender can help to compensate for what they did in financial ways or in other ways, and the victim feels more satisfied as a result, and the offender kind of learns the implications of what they did as a result, that seems to me to be a good thing. And what needs to be resisted is this idea that everybody has to get the same punishment based on what they knew at the time they committed the offense. I mean, that's the idea, that's the obstacle, that is the obstacle to restorative justice, because that won't happen. Now, it's ironic in some ways that that's an obstacle, because it certainly doesn't happen in our current criminal justice system. If a rich offender commits a crime, they're going to get a much lighter sentence in our current system than a poor offender committing that exact same crime. I mean, that's just the practical reality of our criminal justice system and the kinds of lawyers you can afford. The difference between a high-priced lawyer and a public defender is stark. So you're going to have that anyway, but the thing that our criminal justice system can boast is, at least in theory, that wouldn't be possible, or that wouldn't be considered just. Whereas with restorative justice, even in theory, you can just definitely have different punishments for similar kinds of offenses, right? Based on what the victim wants and what the offender wants and how they resolve and the outcome that they want to reach. You just have to swallow that. But I think that's something that we accept in every aspect of everyday life, right? I mean, the example I use in the book is, if I go to a conference and my friend goes to a conference and we both cheat on our wives under similar circumstances, and then my wife throws me out, but my friend's wife decides to take him back and make the marriage work.
Call it an open marriage?
Or just like, no, I'm taking you back, but I'm going to be a little more vigilant this time. No more conferences, whatever that outcome is. Meanwhile, I'm out on the street and my wife won't talk to me.
You're in the next justice porn video?
Right. Like, nobody thinks, oh, that's not fair that they were treated differently for the same offense. It's like, yeah, of course the victim here, or the in this case the wives, get a say in how this outcome is going to be resolved, and nobody thinks that's radically unjust in any way. And all I'm saying is, we extend that general kind of flexibility and that incorporation of the victim's desires and interests and needs into other punishment processes, whether it's in the school or the juvenile courts or the adult courts.
I'm definitely sympathetic to parts of this picture, although other parts worry me. So the clearest win here is that it gets rid of the notion of a victimless crime. That just goes completely out the window, which it should have, hundreds of years ago, because a crime is really a debt formed between the criminal and someone. But it seems to me that the debt can also it also extends in the case of most crimes, maybe all crimes, beyond the victim to the rest of society. And that seems to, I don't know that if restorative justice denies that outright or just puts less emphasis on it, but it seems to me that if you're actually worried about the consequences of human misbehavior, you want to know how people are affected in the aggregate from, various crimes. And I bet there are surprises in store for us. If we could get the data, we could be surprised to learn that some things that we consider to be fairly innocuous are actually much more harmful and confounding to human well-being, year after year, than things that strike us as just pure instances of evil for which people should be locked up forever.
Well, this is what I think. Like, the floor and the ceiling are set by these kinds of consequentialist considerations you're mentioning, right? So I do think that no matter what the victim wants, if there is a crime that causes harm to society in such a way that the person going free, based on what the victim wanted, based on maybe the victim forgiving the offender entirely, that's just too damaging to society.
Yeah, imagine a rapist who's raping only the most forgiving Christians, right?
Right,
So,
exactly.
you just go through the neighborhoods raping people who will see it as the core of their moral integrity as to fully forgive the perpetrator. Well, then you
Sure.
still have to admit that there's a cost to
Right, of
the
course.
rest of society having rapists run free.
Now, I will say that this example, though, is one that often gets tossed in a critical way towards restorative justice. Usually not in this context of the damage you're doing to society by letting rapists go free, but more the secondary victimization of the rape victim. So it's bad enough to be sexually assaulted, but now you have to face the person who did it. But in fact,
Oh, so you're saying that, just so I understand you, you're saying that the process of just kind of going through the restorative justice procedure where the victim has to weigh in on what he or she wants, that process is often worried that that is sort of re-victimizing or some additional cost being imposed on the victim.
yes, and that's the worry. And in some cases, that worry is real and actual. In a lot of cases, though, there is a degree of empowerment that sexual assault survivors or victims get when they face their offender in one of these kinds of conferences or mediation centers. Um, so they did this survey in Canada recently. 89% of violent crime victims wanted to meet their offenders, and 70% of rape survivors said they would welcome the opportunity for victims to be able to meet with their offenders in a kind of conference setting. So these kind of empowering effects that can come are, I think, surprising and something that you can only fully appreciate are if you either get a detailed account of these encounters or you're actually a witness to them. But yeah, of course, to go back to your point, you need to set these boundaries that take into account what kind of message you're sending to potentially future criminals, right? To future criminals who might be thinking about acting in a certain way. So that's where the floor for punishment comes. And it's also where the ceiling for punishment might come as well. Although I think the ceiling is more set by by consequentialist considerations that concern the criminal and also the effects of having a really high prison population.
Well, what if it's just the case? Let's say we do this, vast analysis of human well-being and its antithesis, and we discover that the most costly crime at the moment is online fraud, identity theft and just stealing people's passwords and their data. And the cost is imposed in all kinds of ways that we feel, but in ways that we don't understand how these micro costs are aggregating. So, everyone's had the experience of trying to manage all their passwords online and hack back into their life. And untold hours are squandered with all of us failing to do this. And, people wind up dying because they're, trying to get into their iTunes account and they can't remember their password while they're driving so they can listen to an audiobook or whatever it is. They, drive into trees. And this happens because there are billions of people suffering these little glitches due to all the people who steal passwords and steal stuff online. This is happening to people by the billions every day, year after year. And it just turns out that the price we're paying for having to maintain our passwords and in terms of lost economic prosperity and actual pain and suffering, it is worse than child molesters or anything else that is causing people suffering. So what if we figure that out? Would the rational and just thing to do be just to actually punish that crime more severely than any other crime?
Well, I mean, it's funny that you're raising this in the context of restorative justice for a couple of reasons. Number one, that's actually the kind of crime that restorative justice can't really handle because there's no real identifiable victims, or there's so many identifiable victims that you couldn't have the kind of localized process that restorative justice is really effective.
Couldn't we run the same calculation though? I mean, if we all recognized, if it just were a fact that, we're losing $1 trillion a year in the U.S. to this misbehavior, and we all know what we could be spending that trillion on, because we can translate money into the safety of our airplanes, the safety of our roads, the medical care that's not getting dispensed. I mean, you can translate it into mortality points. If there were no doubt about the actual consequence, couldn't we then just advertise to the teenagers of the world, okay, it turns out crime is not what you thought it was. You all recognize that it's bad to hit someone over the head with a hammer and steal their wallet, but given how dependent we all are on the internet now and financial transactions online and everything else, any one of you who gets online and starts stealing passwords or infecting computers with viruses or malware, you are actually the worst person in society. Now, whatever you think about what you're doing, we're going to destroy your life if we catch you.
Well, I mean, and so you would, right, you would make the punishment for that like as great as the punishment for homicide or something like that. I guess the second reason I'm curious as to why you're raising this in this context is that's exactly the kind of objection, or it's sometimes framed as a reductio ad absurdum, of consequentialist approaches to punishment, which is that it could lead to what seems like intuitively an unjust outcome. Let's say you could eliminate shoplifting entirely by just having like execution for shoplifting. If you just execute.
But it's a different example in the sense that it's us being surprised by the consequences of what is seemingly innocuous by comparison, and then having to recalibrate because they actually are the consequences. I mean, I think it would only be just, again, this is just kind of a thought experiment, but it would only be just in my mind if we could successfully advertise this change in values. Surprise, surprise, we didn't realize that all of this good-natured fun you kids were having with your computers is harmful as it is. But, planes are falling out of the sky because of what you just did on the FAA website. So insofar as that would be successfully communicated, then you would have to be, I mean, the mismatch ethically, or at least the concern is that you could have perfectly good people who would have no reason to expect that they're causing this level of human misery, but in fact they are. And so to hold them accountable for that level of human misery seems unjust, because these are not the kinds of people who want to harm people. They just want to steal credit card information, right?
Right. No, I get the example, and I get the sort of the idea behind it. What I'm not understanding is its connection to restorative justice, or are we just... Oh, it seems more a question about consequentialist approaches to punishment in general.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering whether our sense of having been victimized it may just be a definition of restorative justice that society can't be a victim.
One thing about restorative justice, nobody thinks, even the greatest proponents of it, that it can be appropriate for every conceivable crime or even every actual crime. There's just going to be crimes. And I think this kind of widespread fraud that affects, hundreds of thousands of people, you can't get 100,000 people in a room to try to work out how to make that up. I mean, you can have multiple victims. I think we saw sort of not exactly an approximation of restorative justice, but a baby step towards it in the Michigan State thing, where the doctor told the gymnasts, and then in the trial, in the sentencing process, each victim got a chance to express to
The victim impact statements, yeah.
Yeah, they're in the impact statements about what happened to them and uh, and how it affected them. That's a case where there are multiple victims, but still a sufficiently small number of victims that it's possible to even engage in that little baby step towards an actual restorative process. But then, you can't do that in cases of widespread fraud, or in cases where it really is society that's the victim and not an identifiable person. In that case, you just have to use whatever other approach you think is most effective. And I think for those kinds of cases, I'd probably agree with you that consequentialism is the right way to handle it. Nobody has interest in societies collapsing or airplanes falling out of the sky. And so you have to address that in the most effective way that you can.
Right. But the restorative paradigm still is consequential, right? You're asking the victim to give an account of the consequences for him or her and the consequences going forward. So like you care in this case what the victim wants to happen to the perpetrator to some degree. And if the victim, let's say the victim is against the death penalty and would have her suffering compounded if her child's murderer were killed, then in a restorative paradigm, you want that taken into account because all things being equal, you want the victim
yes.
to be better off rather than worse.
Right. But I think there are consequentialist benefits, and I think you could defend restorative justice from a purely consequentialist perspective. The way I approach it is to recognize and embrace the consequentialist benefits. But to me, there's also separate benefits of just justice. Like, I do think it's the most just outcome. And in a particular case, even if it didn't lead to the best outcome from a consequentialist perspective, I would still think it's something that we ought to embrace just for justice reasons.
Well, that's where our meta ethics collide.
Now, it's one of those happy. This is the thing. This is why I wish it was a little more widespread of a movement that it is. It happens to, I think, have both features. It happens to be in many cases will lead to the best consequences for both society and for the people involved, and be most just when it functions effectively. But I, in a way that I think you don't, separate those two kinds of benefits.
Yeah. Why do you feel the need to separate them? Because it seems the need to separate them would only be evident if you could find a case where justice, the thing seeming just, was not a matter of the good effects of it seeming so on the minds of all involved and on the future behavior of people like ourselves, right? It's like justice matters because it matters to people.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I think in the second time you came on, right, we had a version of this discussion, except it took like 3 hours.
Yeah, this could be 2 hours on this point.
At a certain point, consequentialism and the kind of view that I'm talking about start to merge in a way that the distinction between them seems very hard to identify. I guess the kind of case that I'm talking about would be one where the victim feels satisfied, the community feels satisfied, but maybe the outcome isn't optimal for society at large. It's not destructive for society at large, but it's not optimal. There was a optimal outcome that the relevant parties involved didn't reach. And had that been the outcome, maybe the victims and the offenders and the family members would have been less satisfied, but society would be better off. In that kind of case, I would still endorse the restorative approach, even though it led to a less optimal outcome. Although, again, I think that often it leads to the better outcome. But even if it didn't, as long as the people involved achieved a kind of resolution that felt right for them, I think that that has kind of intrinsic value over and above whatever consequences it has for those people and for society at large.
Right, right. Well, so I suspect you're smuggling in the collective benefit of focusing on the individuals in this case. So we all recognize we live in a world where occasionally we're going to be the individuals who should be treated as individuals and shouldn't just be part of some vast calculation that takes society at large as the locus of moral concern. So we want to preserve that world. We think that there's a good to society in the end, whether the calculation seems to work out or not, by treating people as individuals in their own case. But also, you're not spelling out what the difference is between the optimal solution for society and what was achieved in this case. And if that difference were great enough, well, then we'd all be forced to recognize that, the price was too high. That has to be like a hair's breadth.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I do think that there is so if the price was too high, that's the key, right? There can be a price, there can be a consequentialist price for restorative justice, but I don't think that price should be too high as society. So if the price is, from a consequentialist perspective, for society is going to be too high for the restorative outcome, then I think, then you have to go with the consequences at that point. Where I think we disagree, if we disagree about this at all, I don't know, I see you committed to even any price, a tiny price, is not worth paying for what would otherwise seem like a just outcome for the people involved. And I'm willing to pay some price, just not too high a price. And where that boundary is vague.
I think I'm willing to acknowledge that there's a price paid to just having to figure out what the price is. There's a price to be paid for not catering to our local sense of justice in many cases. And I think, when in doubt, it makes sense to be willing to absorb those prices so as to satisfy the people who you absolutely know are involved and who are the most salient victims. Like the rounding error should always happen in the direction of helping people get what they think they want in the local case. It actually does kind of wind back to the apparent justice in a lot of those YouTube videos, right? Whereas, like, I recognize that in a better society, none of those videos would be possible because the bully would not have had the opportunity to misbehave, and certainly...
Or wouldn't want to misbehave, or wouldn't want to take advantage of a weaker person.
Right.
Yeah.
And the weaker person wouldn't have had to prove his courage in defending himself. And my consequentialist picture would have to account for all that is lost in addition to all that's gained when all of that changes. And so it's interesting to consider in a perfectly well-ordered society where courage is no longer necessary on some level, what is lost when we no longer have to develop courage. We would want to, in the service of some higher ideal at that point, we'd want to create artificial circumstances by which we developed courage, because we would think that courage is probably still important ultimately.
Yeah, it's part of living a good life. The restorative justice thing, I was curious what you thought about it, because I think you are somebody that likes to, when you get into conflicts, handle them yourself.
Mete out rough justice.
Yeah, exactly.
Or complicate my life by trying.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like, you didn't want to just have a social media fight with Ezra Klein. You wanted to hash it out. And now maybe it didn't work out in that case, but that impulse to try to resolve it and to try to address the grievances that you felt and that he might have felt, like, that's a good impulse. That's, I think, something that is worth preserving. And it's just something that is absent in how we handle criminal conflicts and even conflicts at lower levels. I mean, restorative justice in the schools is something new and really it's a real positive development for handling the kinds of conflicts that inevitably arise in school. I mean, we're just not going to have that environment where there are no bullies, but you can have an environment where the tendency to bully is handled in a different way, and where the bullies have to face up to what they've done. They have to face up to victims, they have to face up to other kids. And that's, there's a lot of benefits just in terms of solidarity and community, and the way norms and boundaries get clarified when you have these kinds of face-to-face personal interactions. You start to understand where other people are coming from and understand what the constraints on behavior should be in a way that just you can't get if you're just suspended from school for a week. That then you just get further alienated and your grievances just get greater. And if you're expelled, well, now you're out on the street, and nothing good is going to happen from that. So I think there's one of the things I think honor cultures get that we don't is some of the benefits that can come from conflicts, just in terms of bringing the community together and in terms of clarifying norms of what's acceptable and what isn't. A lot of times that can only really be internalized when you have these face-to-face encounters.
Yeah, well, that's one thing we seem to be lacking, which you might have specifics in your book that I didn't notice, but none are coming readily to mind now. But it seems like honor cultures often have some mechanism by which someone can re-enter the tribe or the society in good standing, having done something dishonorable or something shameful. And it's one of the advantages of having very long and powerful levers to pull, even if they're anchored to something that seems imaginary, like honor or a religious taboo or something else, is that you can have rituals of expiation that allow someone to kind of reboot the hard drive and get their life back together in kind of in a radical sense in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is something that we lack as a society. Not only do we lack ways of reintegrating offenders back into their community and back into society, we actually make it harder, right? We have the box of that they have to check that they've committed a federal offense in order to get a job, and then a lot of people just won't hire them because this is after they've paid their debt and served their time, and they're still being punished, there's the society is still making it difficult for them to re-enter the community and survive without committing more crimes. And in honor cultures and in restorative justice, restorative approaches, there is always a stage for reintegrating the offender within the community once the sentence has been served or the compensation has been achieved, and everybody's satisfied. They also devote resources to reintegrating the offender and making them a valuable part of the community, enabling them to contribute to the community, maybe in ways that they didn't before. And yeah, that's not something we pay any attention to. In fact, we place obstacles on that happening. And again, that's one of the great benefits of restorative justice, is that it does have that stage. It has the stage of determining guilt and innocence, the stage of determining the sentence or the outcome, the resolution of the conflict, and then the stage of reintegrating the offender.
How do you, as a moral philosopher, think about forgiveness and the restoration of a person's identity in society? So I guess let's just sharpen it up with an actual example. I mean, what do you think should happen to someone like, let's say, Harvey Weinstein, if he genuinely takes responsibility, insofar as we can make sense of that philosophically, for his crimes and near crimes, and just seeks to re-enter society with a genuine intention to repair some of the damage he's done. What does moral philosophy and your focus on it do for your apish intuitions about what society should allow in that case?
Well, so Harvey Weinstein is a little bit of a tough case because, first of all, it does seem hard to imagine him taking responsibility in the way that you describe in a sincere way. And also, I don't know the extent of his offenses. But let me give you a related example. So, you know this guy, Dan Harmon, who does Rick and Morty and who was the showrunner for Community, that show. So he was called out also for one of these Me Too by a writer who was on Community for being for sexual harassment. Essentially, he harassed her as one of his writers for a year or a couple years, and she called him out on Twitter. And he has a podcast, and he went on the podcast, and he just, like, I guess he spent 9 minutes. If you listen to it, it's pretty interesting, describing what he had done, taking full responsibility for it, describing the ways in which he understands now that he harmed the writer, and not asking for forgiveness, but just apologizing and holding himself accountable for it. And so he does that. The podcast goes out, and she both forgave him publicly, and she forgave him privately, or they talked privately. He gave her a personal apology, and they hashed it out. And that seems like a perfect example of how, when you actually bring the people together, you have this outcome that is satisfying for the person who was primarily harmed, and a way for the offender to really reflect on what it is that they've done and take responsibility for it. And I don't know what the analog would that be for Harvey Weinstein doing that. Again, I'm not exactly sure what
A 90-minute podcast?
right. It would exactly. It might even have to be like, he might even have to do like a video of himself or something, basing himself in some way. I don't know. But that seems like on a smaller scale, maybe, well, surely, an example of exactly how this kind of thing could be handled. And once it is handled that way, and she was very clear on Twitter that it's important for her to publicly forgive him. And it was important for him to publicly affirm the wrong that he did, and why it was wrong, and why it was harmful. Now that message goes out to the community that this kind of behavior is unacceptable, but it doesn't mean that you're banned for life. You know, it doesn't mean that you have, because if you have no hope, then what incentive do you have of even trying to make up for what you've done, if nobody's going to ever pay attention to you, or if everybody is going to condemn you until you go to your grave?
Yeah, it's interesting because it feels like we're in a culture where there are, for many things, there is no hope, right? So we close the door to any possible future this person has among us for comparatively minor indiscretions, or even things that in a previous generation weren't even thought to be indiscretions. And then you have other people who find a very different door, having misbehaved terribly, but that it not only becomes a non-issue, it becomes the basis for their future contribution to society. So, for instance, I just did a few podcasts back, with this guy Christian Picciolini, who was a former neo-Nazi skinhead, and in his life as a neo-Nazi skinhead, he did a lot worse than harass people. I mean, he was just going out and, kicking people unconscious with his steel-toed boots regularly. It's actually a miracle that he didn't wind up in prison for a good long time. I mean, he was behaving in the most extreme way short of murder for years. And yet now he's someone who is a deprogrammer in most cases, neo-Nazis and white supremacists. And he gives TED Talks, and he comes on my podcast, and he's been profiled on 60 Minutes. He's like a darling of liberal society now because he's turned his life around and is now giving back. But it's interesting to consider that how hard that would be for someone whose misbehavior is by any measure less sinister. It strikes me as hard for
like Louis C.K. or something
like Charlie Rose or something. I mean, Harvey Weinstein might be setting the bar a little high, but I mean, strangely, it would seem like it would be harder to prove your sincerity in a mea culpa if you're Charlie Rose than if you were a neo-Nazi skinhead covered with swastika tattoos who has a change of heart.
Well, yeah, I mean, so part of it also is the good, and you should, I think, embrace this as a consequentialist, the good that he can do. He can reach young white supremacists or proto-white supremacists in a way that other people can't. There's an analog here with gang violence. Like the most effective programs that reduce gang violence recruit former gang members because they're the ones that have the sufficient respect of the people involved that they'll actually listen to them. And so, this guy that you had on, he can do a ton of good. And if you, as you say, it's easy for us to see the sincerity of what he's doing because of how extremely messed up his worldview was before, and because of the severity of his misbehavior, just how immoral it was. And so it's easy to see that he has changed, and it's easier perhaps to welcome the kinds of effects that he has now that he has been redeemed in this particular way. It's a little harder, Louis C.K., he's not going to go around and start preaching to young comics to not whip their dicks out, right? Like that's not going to have the same effect.
Does suggest a possible next comedy special he could attempt.
Exactly.
The scared straight version of.
Yeah. Look what happens. But, I don't know. I think we're early in this Me Too process. It's early, but it does seem like people tend to rebound from these kinds of things eventually. And maybe it will take longer than we'd like for some of these people based on what we think the severity of their offenses were. But Americans do like a comeback story. They do like a redemption story.
I wasn't expecting to talk about Me Too with you here, but I'm interested to know where you would draw the line here, because I think there's a line, I don't know where it is, but there's a line to the left of which we're not going to see any of these people again. And if you're on the right side of that line, you will have a comeback. And I suspect because of how he responded and because of the nature of the offenses, Louis C.K. is on the right side of that line. I mean, and also given that he was a comic. But I would expect that Charlie Rose and Kevin Spacey and I mean certainly Harvey Weinstein are on the left side of that line, and there will be no comeback.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly bet on Louis C.K. making a comeback. Charlie Rose, I mean, it's also a question of what they have to offer the world. And I think Louis C.K. can incorporate what he did into his art in a way that people will find ultimately appealing. But having Charlie Rose come back and do more of those interviews that were already getting kind of tired at the time. So, I mean, part of the equation, whether this is fair or not, is, well, what's the benefit that can come from, artistically or in terms of what kinds of norms you can broadcast or the ways in which it would be healthy for everybody involved to see you take responsibility and be reintegrated into the community. And with someone like Charlie Rose, who's already on the backside of his career, it's a little harder to imagine. But I could imagine a sort of a younger version of Charlie Rose, in the earlier part of his career. And again, I don't exactly know what Charlie Rose did. I know he was creepy, and I know he was accused of sexual, but he wasn't accused of sexual assault, was he?
Not that I'm aware of. No, but it was just kind of just the professional impediment that's posed to so many people working under him. And I mean, he was kind of way across the line in terms of the power imbalance and the harassment side of this thing in a way that Louis C.K. wasn't. But I was like Kevin Spacey is the easier example because it's easy to see that he could have done many more movies and many more seasons of House of Cards or whatever it was, and the people perceive a real artistic loss there. I mean, they would want Kevin Spacey to be back in film for at least another decade, but I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I mean, I would put the chance at near zero for that.
I mean, maybe, yeah. I don't know. Gun to my head, will Kevin Spacey ever appear in a film or TV show again?
In a film made in the United States. I guess I'm sure you can find some
Roman
Eastern
Polanski,
European
look at Mel
country.
Gibson,
Yeah.
look at...
Well, I mean, Roman Polanski is an interesting case because I think by today's standards, I mean, one would have thought even yesterday's standards, he should not have had a career at all after that. I mean, that was what's alleged in his case is completely insane. Although I think, this does connect to our previous conversation.
Yeah.
Because yeah. So take me there. Hasn't his victim forgiven him, and doesn't she think that his travel ban is unwarranted?
Yeah, she's been petitioning the judges to lift the ban for a long time, and they refuse to do it. Again, out of this idea of justice. I mean, you can't. It's hard to even defend on consequentialist standards because it's not like he poses a current danger to the world or that people will see him being allowed back in the United States and say, oh, I guess it's okay for me to have sex with a 13-year-old in Jack Nicholson's hot tub.
Drug and sodomize a 13-year-old in a hot tub?
Yeah, so that's a question of where that is a case where her wishes weren't taken into account after many, many years, of her trying.
I think you're on the wrong side of this. This is a perfect example where the victim's wishes and even a person's capacity or likelihood of reoffending is not the right measurement of justice. I mean, I think if you're someone who, now again, I'm assuming that what is alleged here is in fact what happened, but let's grant me that he actually did drug and anally rape I think it was a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. If you do that, whether or not it seems likely you're going to do that again, based on, your age or anything else, the society has an interest in making an example of you.
Sure, but society has made an example of him, right? I mean, so I don't think that if the victim had wanted to do this 2 years after the fact, that I would have a different opinion about this. But now we're talking about 40 years after the fact, 30 years after the fact, where the victim has had plenty of time to think about it and now what she wants, I think, has to be taken into serious account.
Isn't also part of the problem is that he never admitted? Did he admit anything, or there has been no mea culpa from him, right?
I don't know the details of the case. I know he fled. So that's another part of the problem is that he did not take responsibility in a way that you would want somebody who's being reintegrated to take responsibility. And I think he's doing that for legal reasons, perhaps. And who knows what sort of private interactions they've had, if they've had any at all. I have no idea. But yeah, I mean, that's one where I don't think it's a no-brainer, but I do think this idea that we shouldn't take her wishes into account at all, that seems completely wrong to me.
All right, so this is the difference between our moral philosophies. I want to see Roman Polanski in the next justice porn video, and you want him to come back to the U.S. and make movies from the comfort of his home in Beverly Hills.
No, I mean, I could see him, and he could be in the next justice porn video getting his ass kicked and then also make movies,
Yes, they should be in
They're
the
not
same
mutually
movie. Yes,
exclusive.
you could integrate them into the same project.
Same, exactly. That's the next Roman Polanski joint.
I will pay to see that. And to hear it reviewed on your podcast, which you guys do. That's some of your most delightful work, the movie reviews that you and David do. So I recommend that to our listeners.
Well, that's what I really wish it was, is a movie review podcast, because I love film and I love doing deep dives. So yeah, well, thanks for having me on, Sam.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Just to tell people where to find you, what do you want them to know? A Twitter address or anything else?
At Tamler, just my first name is my Twitter handle, as the kids call it. Or do they even call it that? I don't even know.
I have no idea. The kids are 30, as far as I can tell.
And right on Twitter. They can go to tamlersommers.com. That's my webpage. And please consider purchasing Why Honor Matters, which should be available in bookstores and on Amazon and various other online sites. It's a book that I spent a lot of time working on and I'm fairly proud of. So